All right, everybody. Welcome, bienvenidos. Are we ready to learn some stuff? Oh, God. Are we ready to learn some stuff? Okay, awesome. Cool. My name is Ellie, and I'm going to talk to you today about internationalization. I had to practice saying internationalization a lot for this talk. I'm a web engineer at Monzo, which is a bank in the UK. You can find me on Twitter at EllieBelly. It's mostly that so people knew it was Ellie and not Eli, but that's a whole other story. And I want to get to know each other a little bit. I'm not a narcissist, I promise, but I want to tell you my emoji life story. So I was born in Mexico. It was an accident. My family is originally from Nicaragua, so we moved back there. Then I went to college in the United States of America, lovely place. While I was living there, I did an exchange program for a semester in China, and now I'm working and living in the United Kingdom. And this will become relevant, I promise. In case any of you were wondering, that is where Nicaragua is. I get asked that a lot, so a little geography there. And that's where the United Kingdom is, but I'm sure you've heard. And that's where we are right now, in the belly button of the peninsula. So let's talk about internationalization. It's not a very glamorous topic, but it is timeless, so I love talking about it. And importantly, it's not always about language. It could always be in the same language, but with different cultural, regional stuff. Before we get started, I want to talk to you about what it is. Internationalization is often abbreviated to I-18N, which, just so we're all clear, is a type of word called a numeronym, which is a number-based word. For example, numbers as sounds, like canine for police dog units, or later from texting, I guess, like see you later. Numbers as meaning, like 007, James Bond, or 24/7, when something is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Or adding up the number of letters between the first and the last, and then using that number instead of the middle of the word. Wow, what a good idea. And we use this a lot in software development. You might have seen it in accessibility, which is A11Y or LI, or localization, which is L10N. And then, of course, internationalization. And then, as a bonus, that's the numeronym for numeronym, in case you ever need that in your life. So what is internationalization, or I-18N? And why is it important? And I thought that in order to get all of you excited about it, and all of you wanting to work on it, I would consult my most trusted advisor first, and find out some numbers. We all love numbers, right? So in the world, the languages of websites roughly break down to this. About 52% are in English as their main language, followed as a far, far second by Russian, okay, German, Spanish, Japanese, French, your Romance languages, you got them. The users of the internet, however, roughly break down like this: 25.5% English, 20% Chinese, which makes sense, followed by Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese, Indonesian. You might notice that these two sides don't match up, and that is where the problem starts. If you are creating software, especially on the internet, especially on the web, you are inherently leaving some people out by defaulting to English only. Obviously, it's a good sort of like popular second language, but you should have options. So the first thing I want to mention as a big takeaway is that internationalization is part of accessibility, especially on the web, but also in stuff like documentation, for example. And I really liked this description from W3 Standards about internationalization. If you internationalize, you design or develop your content, application, specification, and so on in a way that ensures it will work well for, or can be easily adapted for users from any culture, region, or language. Now there's two big things here. It's a great definition. One is that it can be easily adapted for. Internationalization doesn't mean you go to your website and you translate it right away. Internationalization means that you build your software in a way that is flexible enough to be localized later. So you can internationalize your site and then not actually translate it or whatever until later. The other point is that it's from any culture, region, or language. So it's not just translations. There are regional differences, there are cultural differences that you need to be aware of or mindful of depending on what market or what group of people you're internationalizing for. So how does this work? Usually, it works something like this. You have some code for your software, your website, and then instead of writing the strings right in there, you leave a template. And then you point that template to a resource file for a specific language, usually English. You also shouldn't represent languages with flags, but that's a whole other issue and a whole other talk. I'm not going to mention that. I'm doing it, sorry. And then one day you decide that you want to localize your site. So you grab your templates and instead point them to a different language file, and then a different one. And that's usually how it works, is by leaving placeholders. So what do these files look like that we're pointing at? Usually it's some sort of like ID value. How does that look up there? Nice, okay. And then in the code, you can refer to them by ID. So if you have like a templating sort of engine, like handlebars, or React. How many of you are familiar with the syntax of React? Just show of hands. Okay, cool. So some of my examples are in React, so my apologies if you don't read it, but I have some other ones too. Or just plain JavaScript. You can just call it as a function, which is also usually how it works with stuff like mobile. And then, so you usually say, instead of having a string, you put in the ID and you look for that ID in the relevant file. Here is that code zoomed in. Now, what else do we need to think about? Like I said, it's not just language. We also have writing systems and line breaks. Not everyone uses ABCs. You have stuff like Thai, Arabic. Date and time. I don't know, is anyone here American by any chance? What date is that? Yeah, okay. So here, that would be, what, January 8th, right? So that's the kind of thing you have to think about. Writing direction, not all languages are left to right or right to left. Sometimes you want to do stuff in both directions. So if you have like a right to left language, but you're referencing maybe a left to right book title in your text, that's something you have to think about. Stuff like ordering, pluralization, sort of first, second, grammar and sentence structure, pronouns, relative time, so like days ago, like Facebook comments. And then as a bonus, stuff like color theory or responsive design, which I won't get into a ton here. But colors have meanings culturally that vary very widely. Has anyone tried to internationalize a site before? Piece of cake, right? Super easy, super quick. So that it's kind of a lie. I kind of lied a little bit. It's actually very hard, and there's a lot of moving parts. So I'm like, yes, it is a piece of cake, but imagine the cake is like a multi-tiered, sparkled, rhinestoned wedding cake with roses. So I decided to make my own cake, and I'm going to walk you through how or what you need to know to be equipped to internationalize anything. So the bottom half of the cake is a lot of standards. We all love standards, I know, but I'll make them super fun. And then the top is sort of web-specific stuff, which is optional, libraries, that kind of thing. Cool. So first things first, thanks to Unicode, we can be very global on the internet. They gave us emoji, they gave us Chinese. The Unicode Consortium is in charge of developing the use of both the Unicode standard, which assigns a number to each character in every language, in every script, which is amazing, and we actually didn't have that for a while. So if you have any text, make sure it's encoded in Unicode, UTF-8, or UTF-16, which is a thing. But actually, they're also in charge of two technical committees, CLDR and ICU, which I'll talk about, what those acronyms are in a second. And they're also in charge of the bidirectional text algorithm for displaying different directions of languages on the web. So let's talk about the bidirectional algorithm first. Each character in Unicode, each letter, each character, is encoded either strongly or weakly. So strongly, like the letter A. Weakly, if it's like an exclamation point, because that one could go either way. With a direction, left to right, right to left. So for example, here is the word Egypt in English and the word Egypt in Arabic. The top one is encoded left to right, the bottom one is encoded right to left. It then also displays these characters relatively to the document or the file's overall direction. So like I said, if maybe your main document is left to right, but one of your words is right to left, that's how it'll display the order of the words. For example, this is 3 city names, or I guess city, country is fine. Bahrain, and then Egypt in Arabic, Kuwait. The word for Egypt is still right to left, but the order of the words is left to right. Now, if your document was right to left, the order of your words would be right to left, and then the direction of your English words is still left to right. In HTML, there is a dir, or direction attribute. If you're ever working with languages that change direction, make sure to use it so that Unicode knows how to write your text, basically. So that's pretty cool. Then, I found out, writing this talk, there is something called the Internet Engineering Task Force, which sounds pretty cool. In my mind, it looks like this, but a girl can dream. They publish these files called Best Common Practices, or BCP. And they have one called BCP 47, catchy, I know, which describes how to write a tag for identifying a locale. And a lot of you may have seen these before. They look like this. Basically what it says is that you first have a language tag, which is usually 2 letters, and then a dash, and then X number of subtags depending on what region script. There's a whole list. For example, up here we have English, which is EN, as spoken in the US. Month first, ladies, yep. Then we have English as spoken in Great Britain. The second one is Mongolian in the Cyrillic script, as spoken in Mongolia. The following one, ZH, is Chinese, spoken in the traditional character set, because there's a traditional set and a simplified set, as spoken in Hong Kong. And the last one uses 419, which is a regional sort of like subdirectory. So 419 actually stands for Latin America and the Caribbean. So this would be Spanish as spoken in Latin America and the Caribbean. Objectively the best Spanish, but I guess this is the wrong crowd for that. Fine. So if you remember my life story, see, I told you it would come back. What are my locales? Well, they look like this. So let's say I'm surfing the web and I come to your site. What are you going to show me? How do you know what I want? How do you know what I speak? So important super point number 2, always let the user choose their own locale. Now, if you take anything from this talk, it's this. This is the most important part of getting internationalization right. Always let the user choose their own locale. Always let the user. Great, you got it, thank you. Cool. I'm letting you internalize that right now. All right, moving on. There is this very cool thing called the CLDR, which stands for Common Locale Data Repository. Again, super catchy, these standards. It's basically like 20 megabytes of XML that have the entire world's languages in it, and then specific words in those languages. So it has stuff like, also some regional stuff. So like dates, times, do they use 24-hour, do they use 12-hour, do they use time zones? How do you say the name of the time zone in that language? Countries, cities, writing direction, telephone codes, calendar conventions. Does the week start on a Sunday, on a Monday? Basically, everything you needed to know about hitting a new market or localizing for a specific locale exists in this file. Now, it's an XML, which we all love, so developers don't usually interact with it directly. Here's a little example of what it looks like. So this is days of the week in Spanish. It has its own sort of like XML standard language, and you have sort of like the abbreviated version, the short version, the long word. If you did get curious and wanted to play, you can download all 20 megs of it from the Unicode website. Super fun. You can also, there's a JSON version on GitHub, which is easier if you're into web stuff. CLDR. It's awesome. Now, like I said, a lot of developers don't usually deal with the CLDR directly. Once upon a time, there was this library called the ICU, International Components for Unicode. Their technical committee is also under the Unicode Consortium, which is a set of C and C++ and Java libraries that wrap CLDR. Java, that's not JavaScript, but the ICU, when it came out, defined a format for writing the strings. You remember how earlier we had placeholders that pointed to a string file? There's actually, the ICU, a message format that you can write those strings as, which translators are usually familiar with, as well as developers. So let me show you what that looks like. Was that on the? There we go. You can just have placeholders, curly brackets, and then the name of a variable, which you can pass in when you call for the string. So welcome, name, variable. You can also give it a variable and then a format type. So you can say there were count people there, and then tell it that it's a number. So, and you also have to tell it which locale it is. So for example, in the thousands, the separator in a lot of places is a comma. I think here is a period, right? Spanish people, yes? Yeah, okay. So it knows stuff like that. Very smart, the ICU message format. You can also tell it a type, so you can tell it this is a date, but it's a short date. So it's sort of like numbers instead of being written out, again, with the month, day thing. You can also give it a select, which is great for pronouns, but a lot of other things. So when you pass in the variable, you can say, oh, well, maybe I have a male, female, or non-binary user, and then the text would change depending on that. So the parts in color are variables or keywords, and then the parts in white are the actual translations, the actual strings. And then you can also give it counts for numbers. So a lot of the times, if you have like a message, if you have 0 messages or 1 message, you can change it based on that, which is very cool. Here is a super fun fact I learned with this. Some languages don't just have singular and plural. Does anyone here speak Russian? No, okay, so in Russian, there is 1 word for 0 things, and there is 1 word for like 2 to 5 things, and there is a different word from like 5 to 11 things, and then a whole other word for more than that. So when you write your string in a string file, you have to fit the whole sentence into account. So you can use keywords in ICU like few and many, because when you get a translator and they come in and make a Russian file, they're going to add more categories, so you need to be prepared for that flexibility. So how do you write for internationalization in this message format? First of all, write full sentences when possible. We are developers, we hate repeating ourselves, so a lot of the times people will try to program their way out of translations. So they'll say the plus variable plus verb, which doesn't work in every language. There's grammar, and then there's ordering of syntax that needs to be thought about. So don't try to build sentences yourself. And then the most complex arguments, try to use as the most outer part of your string, because you can nest them. You can use, I'll show you later, you can use sort of like a select, and then a count, and then like a date, that kind of thing. So let's look at an example. Here is a basic translation. He likes to dance cha-cha in the moonlight, or she or they. So you go, okay, cool. Problem is, I don't know if you've noticed, but the non-gendered pronoun, they, should be they like, not they likes, right? No biggie. We'll just put it in the select. Problem is, when we translate this to almost any language, it will immediately break because the verb has to go in a different order, or we have to use some other pronouns. So that's wrong too. The correct way would be this, where you put the full sentence each time. I know it's repetitive, I know it feels wrong deep down, but languages are so different and so complicated, there's no way your brain can have all of them. So, better safe than sorry. Now, up to this point, it's been a lot of standards that apply to any programming language, to mobile, to web. Now we're getting into the JavaScript-y parts, so alert. There's actually an internationalization API in JavaScript that's built in. ECMA 402, it's still being worked on to improve it, but the basis is there. So in your developer console, you can just go in and type in intel.number format. This is an example of how it works. You basically create a new instance of it. You pass it some options. The first argument is a locale, according to the BCP 47 rules, which we all learned earlier. And then extra options. So the first one, for example, you can say this is a number, but it's also a currency. And then once you've created that object, you then call .format on it, and then pass in your input. The problem with this is that it can get real complicated really fast because of the overhead of having to create a new instance for every set of options. It's kind of hard to administer, and it gets really computationally expensive with a framework like React, for example, that re-renders a lot to be creating new objects. So a lot of people don't use this directly, but rather use libraries that wrap the JavaScript Internationalisation API. The support is fine, not great. There's polyfills. Internationalization in JavaScript is still a work in progress. If you do find yourself interested, these are 2 things that you can Google to find more about what's coming next, what people are working on, give your opinion, etc., etc. Just gonna leave that there. I know you all love standards bodies, so it's a passion, I get it. So let's talk about some libraries so that you can see some examples of this in the real world. Now, disclaimer, there are a bunch of libraries and a bunch of solutions. I gave this talk once and people were like, well, why didn't you use this other library? I'm sure this other library is great. This is the one I use, this is the one I like. So I've been acquainted with FormatJS. It's an open source library. It's run and maintained by Yahoo. Who would have thunk? They have wrappers for React, Ember, Handlebars, and Dust, but will welcome any other framework if you want to go in and open source your way into it. They also have some modules and bundles of like individual functionalities. Like the message format is the translation part that translates strings. So here's an example in React. Now, if you're not familiar with the React syntax, it's very similar. JSX, which is the React sort of like language, is very similar to HTML. So you have like a tag with the angle bracket and then some attributes. Now, if you had a button in your React application, instead of just writing the text of your button, like sign in, you would import something from format, from the React intel bindings, called formatted message. They also have formatted number, formatted date, formatted time, or date time. Yeah, there's a couple. You would give it the ID of your string in that separate string file, which will be different in every language. You can also pass in a default message, so maybe your translator isn't done with your Portuguese translations. So you can always fall back to English maybe, because it's safe. And then a value, which is what is going to be filled in that sort of like template variable. Remember, welcome name, this is where you would pass in name when you call it. And then this is an example of what a string file would look like. That button we saw earlier, the sign-in button, is that first one. So it has the placeholder for name, which you pass in as a variable. And then some other ones, you'll notice the last one is that combined select with plural ICU message format. Again, make sure to use full sentences. If you don't use React, you can also use plain JavaScript with these libraries and just import intil as a package and then just call format message. It takes all the same options, ID, default, and values. So that's our standards cake. Super easy, right? But that's not all, right? Internationalization in the real world has a logistics problem, which is where a lot of companies and developers get tripped up. Let's say you build an app, and then you send it off to get translated. Then you deploy your site. Woohoo! But let's say you add a feature. There's more strings there. You go get them translated. Some of the languages you're translating in are ready. What do? Do you wait for the rest of the languages to come before you can ship your feature? Do you ship your feature with incomplete translations? Do you deploy your site? What if while you're waiting, you add another feature, but then this other feature is ready? You get it, right? Sometimes you have to change existing text. I can't say that, existing text. There's this concept called continuous localization, which is where you try to fit in localization localization into your dev processes. Ideally seamlessly. Spoiler alert, it's never seamless. There's usually something. Because there's this cycle, right, where you write a new text, send it to get translated, put it back into your app, ship, repeat. At my old job, we had a service called Smartling, which is a paid-for service that would check our string files for changes and then send it off to be translated and then commit back into the pull request with the translations, which is pretty cool, very dev forward. Recommend it. Because of a lot of these things, internationalization is much easier to integrate into your project early. Another big idea. A lot of the times it's hard to get buy-in because you're like, I don't have time, I have to ship right now, MVP, lean, agile, whatever. But there's considerations not only with process, but also design, for example, like your UI, that might break once you localize. After the fact, it's harder to retrofit. Let me give you an example. So at my old job, which was called Trainline, which is a train ticket app, you should check it out, it works in Spain. We decided to expand into Europe, and we had to translate to, I think, 16 languages over 24 regions, and also do multi-currency. So we had, you selected a train ticket, or when you got your results, we would tell you, we've selected a ticket that was the cheapest, just to let you know, so that you don't have to change your choice if that's what you want. Great. We then translated to German, which is known for its very short words, and this happened. All of a sudden, we couldn't fit our notice. Now, this isn't so bad, because when we dug deep, we noticed that in the CSS, this bubble had a fixed height. So we were like, easy, just get rid of the fixed height. Boom, done, fixed, move on. Now, we also had a results grid. The UK train system is super complicated, but basically, the rows are the types of tickets, and the columns are the times the trains leave. So you'll notice we had the little pound sign, we had limited availability notices. Even when it was a big amount, we could still fit it on the grid. Then they came and said, well, we want to sell this in French, but to a Swede in krona. All of a sudden, we've lost any sign of the currency symbol. The limited availability message in French barely fits. It is holding its breath. You can tell, right? It's like, so we had to go back and redesign the whole results page, the moneymaker. It took months, and it took like a whole team of developers to turn that into that. You needed UX research, you needed design, you needed developers. You needed to make sure it wouldn't lose you conversion, so there were a lot of A/B tests. So in the long run, not starting early cost us more to retrofit in later. And now you can see the KR symbol is back. The limited availability has room to breathe. A note on that, you can style for specific languages with CSS, but it is not very well supported, so always check support from the specification. It's just :lang. And the most common use is for quotes. Let me show you. So you can have a quote with the Q tag, and then if you do :lang and then you pass it in the language code, you can have different quotes for each language. It's pretty cool, just a fun fact if you ever get curious. Another curiosity, line breaks can become a nightmare with certain languages. Not all languages delimit words, and definitely not with spaces, which would make it easier. Not all languages have obvious places to break a line in text. So like if you speak the language, like Thai, for example, you know where to break it, but it's hard to tell a computer. Here is an example of Khmer, which is sort of like an Asian language. Lao, I think, also is like this, and Thai. These are all the different places where you can break that line, but it's really, really hard for a computer to figure that out, because there's not a space, there's not a Unicode character in there. You just have to know. A lot of people use like a look behind dictionary thing. Some people just break it in the wrong place. So yeah, if you're ever sort of in Southeast Asia with your software, keep an eye out. And here's a link. The slides will be up later as a resource. Cool. So what have we learned so far? 1, internationalization is part of accessibility. Internationalize all the things. That doesn't mean you have to go and get 100 translators right away. It just means you have to build your software flexibly. Use placeholders instead of strings. Easy as that. That already gets you half the way there. When you design, think of what a longer word might look like, or a much smaller word. Like a 12-character word could be 1 character in Chinese. Is there room to grow, room to shrink? Internationalization is supported by a bunch of standards, CLDR, ICU, all on the Unicode site. It helps do it right, and it helps do it the same across software, across with your translators, your other devs. So make sure you're well-versed. And not, the standards are also there because there's a lot of easy to make assumptions with internationalization. So it's easy to assume you can do something when maybe it's not recommended. So the standards sort of save you from that. Try to start early if you can. It's really hard to retrofit. Always, always, always let your users pick their own locale. You guys got it. Wow. And then my LE tip of the day is that German is a great first test languages because the German words are super long. So if your app is going to break, you will find out. Thank you. I've been Ellie. Find me on Twitter. I won't do a Q&A, but find me in the break and ask me stuff. And yeah, have a good day.